You've been lied to, not by a stranger, not by an enemy, by someone who said they loved you. And the worst part, you probably still aren't sure if what happened to you was even real. That's not an accident, that's the design. Emotional abuse doesn't leave bruises you can photograph. It leaves something far more sinister. It makes you question your own memory, your own worth, your own sanity. And right now in this room, there are people sitting with that confusion, carrying wounds they were never even given permission to call wounds. Today, that changes. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to hand you a map, a complete, brutal, honest map of every form of emotional abuse that exists. Because the moment you can name what was done to you, it loses its power over you forever. Most people think abuse has a look. They think it comes with raised fists, visible bruises, and emergency room visits. They think it's loud. They think it's obvious. They think that if something truly terrible is happening to a person, surely it's someone would notice. But emotional abuse doesn't operate that way. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't leave marks that a doctor can photograph or evidence that a lawyer can present in court. It lives in the space between words. It hides inside a tone of voice, a look across the dinner table, a sentence that sounds almost normal until you replay it at 2 in the morning and realize something about it made you feel less than human. This is precisely why emotional abuse is the most underreported, most misunderstood, and most dangerous form of abuse that exists. Not because it's rare, but because it's invisible, and what is invisible is easy to deny. Not just by the abuser, not just by the people around the victim, but by the victim themselves. That's the first thing you need to understand. The invisibility is not a side effect of emotional abuse. It is the entire strategy. When someone hits you, your body knows, your nervous system responds. The evidence exists outside of your mind in the physical world where it can be witnessed, validated, and confirmed. But when someone systematically dismantles your sense of reality through words, silence, manipulation, and psychological pressure, there is no external evidence. There is only your internal experience. And if you've been told enough times that your internal experience is wrong, dramatic, too sensitive, or imagined, or you stop trusting it, that's not weakness. That's what prolonged psychological pressure does to a human being. Think about what it means to live inside that reality. You wake up every morning already second guessing yourself. You rehearse conversations before you have them. You monitor your own facial expressions. You measure your words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield because you've learned through hundreds of small, painful moments that the wrong word, the wrong tone, the wrong timing can trigger something that leaves you feeling demolished for days. And the most disorienting part is that you can rarely point to a single moment and say that that right there is abuse because it rarely lives in single moments. It lives in patterns, patterns that are designed to feel just ambiguous enough that you keep questioning yourself instead of questioning the relationship. This is what separates emotional abuse from ordinary conflict. Every relationship has tension. Every relationship has arguments, misunderstandings, moments where people say things they shouldn't. That's not what we're talking about. Emotional abuse is not a moment, it's a climate. It's the atmosphere of an entire relationship. It's the consistent recurring experience of feeling unseen, unheard, unsafe, and unworthy in the presence of a specific person. And critically, it follows a pattern that always, without exception, serves one purpose: to keep power in the hands of one person and confusion in the mind of the other. The word that experts keep returning to when they define emotional abuse is systematic. It is not accidental. It is not the result of someone having a bad day or struggling with their emotions. Emotional abuse is a system, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, but always a system of behaviors designed to erode another person's psychological autonomy, their ability to think clearly, their ability to trust themselves, their ability to believe that they deserve better. Once that erosion is complete, the abuser doesn't need to work very hard anymore. The victim becomes their own jailer. And here's what makes this wound so uniquely devastating. It attacks the very instrument you would use to identify it and heal from it. Physical injuries damage the body. Emotional abuse damages the mind. It damages perception, memory, self-worth, and judgment. It's as if someone broke into your house and specifically destroyed every mirror, every window, and every clock so that you can no longer see yourself clearly. You can no longer see the outside world accurately, and you have completely lost track of how long you've been living this way. Every abuser has a toolkit. It doesn't come in a box. It isn't something they ordered or studied from a manual. But make no mistake, it is a toolkit, a collection of psychological weapons that have been refined, tested, and sharpened through repeated use on a person who trusted them. And what makes these weapons so devastatingly effective is that most of them don't look like weapons at all. They look like concern, they look like honesty, they look like love, they look like a person simply expressing how they feel. That disguise is not coincidental. That disguise is the entire point. The first and most talked about weapon in this arsenal is gaslighting. The word gets used casually now, almost loosely, but the reality of what it does to a person is anything but casual. Gaslighting is the deliberate distortion of another person's reality. It is when someone looks you in the eye and tells you that what you clearly experienced did not happen, that what you remember you misremembered, that what you felt you misinterpreted, that what you heard you misheard. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A small correction here, a gentle reframing there, but over time it accumulates into something catastrophic. The victim stops reporting their experiences to the outside world because they've already learned to doubt those experiences before they even finish having them. Gaslighting doesn't just distort specific memories, it destroys the victim's fundamental confidence in their own perception of reality. Then there is guilt tripping, one of the most socially acceptable weapons in the abuser's arsenal, which is exactly why it's so dangerous. Guilt tripping is the art of reframing every situation so that the victim is always the one responsible for the abuser's emotional state. You express a need and suddenly you are selfish. You set a boundary and suddenly you are cruel. You dare to be happy about something and the abuser finds a way to connect your happiness to their suffering. The message that gets delivered again and again is this: your emotional needs are a burden, but my emotional needs are your responsibility. That message repeated enough times produces a person who has completely abandoned their own emotional world in order to manage someone else's. The silent treatment is another weapon that society consistently underestimates. It is frequently dismissed as someone simply needing space, needing time to process, needing distance after a conflict. But in the hands of an emotional abuser, silence is not a coping mechanism, it is a punishment. It is a controlled, deliberate withdrawal of presence and warmth designed to produce maximum anxiety in the victim. And it works because human beings are wired for social connection. Being cut off from someone we love triggers the same neurological response as physical pain. The abuser knows this, consciously or not, and they use silence the way a torturer uses isolation, not to heal, but to break. Closely related is the weapon of emotional withholding, where the silent treatment is the withdrawal of communication. Emotional withholding is the withdrawal of warmth, affection, validation, and basic human acknowledgement. The abuser is physically present, but emotionally absent, and they control exactly when that absence lifts and when it descends. The victim spends enormous amounts of psychological energy trying to figure out what they did wrong, what they can do differently, how they can earn back the warmth that has been taken from them. This creates a powerful and deeply unhealthy attachment because the human brain becomes most fixated on rewards that are unpredictable and inconsistent. Criticism dressed as honesty is another weapon that rarely gets recognized for what it is. There is a version of feedback that builds people up even when it corrects them, and then there is the version that an emotional abuser delivers. Consistent, targeted, relentless criticism that is always framed as just being honest or just trying to help. The topics are never random. They zero in on the victim's most sensitive insecurities, their appearance, their intelligence, their competence, their likability, their worth as a partner or parent or professional. Each comment taken alone might seem survivable, but the cumulative effect is a person who has internalized a deeply critical inner voice that now does the abuser's work for them, even in the abuser's absence. Then there is love bombing, followed by devaluation, perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated weapon of all. It begins with an overwhelming flood of affection, attention, admiration, and intensity that feels like nothing the victim has ever experienced. It feels like finally being truly seen. But that flood is not genuine connection, it is investment. The abuser is building emotional credit at a rate that will later justify enormous withdrawals. Once the victim is sufficiently attached, sufficiently convinced that this relationship is the most profound thing that has ever happened to them, the devaluation begins. The warmth cools, the admiration turns to criticism, the attention becomes unpredictable, and the victim, now deeply bonded and deeply confused, spends the rest of the relationship trying to get back to that initial feeling, not realizing that feeling was never real to begin with. There is a question that almost everyone asks when they learn about emotional abuse. It is asked by family members sitting across from someone they love: watching them stay in something that is clearly destroying them. It is asked by friends, by therapists, by strangers on the internet who read a story and cannot comprehend the response. The question is always some version of the same thing. Why don't they just leave? And that question, as understandable as it is, reveals exactly how little most people understand about what emotional abuse actually does to a person's interior world. Leaving is not a simple decision. It is not a matter of courage or self-respect or intelligence. By the time someone is deep inside an emotionally abusive relationship, the very psychological tools they would need to make that decision have already been systematically dismantled. The first thing emotional abuse produces is self-doubt so pervasive that it becomes the victim's default operating system. They no longer trust their own read on situations. They no longer trust their memory of conversations. They no longer trust their emotional responses. They have been corrected, dismissed, and overridden so many times that their internal compass has been completely demagnetized. So when they look at their relationship and feel something is wrong, they do what they've been trained to do. They question themselves first. They wonder if they're being too sensitive. They wonder if they're being ungrateful. They wonder if they're the problem. And that wondering keeps them frozen in exactly the place the abuser needs them to be. This self-doubt creates a fog, a genuine cognitive and emotional fog that makes clear thinking nearly impossible. Victims of emotional abuse frequently describe feeling confused in a way they cannot fully articulate. Not confused about specific facts, but confused in a deeper, more disorienting way. Confused about reality itself, about what is normal, about whether what they are experiencing is something that happens to other people or something they are somehow manufacturing. This fog is not weakness. It is the neurological consequence of living under sustained psychological pressure. The human brain under chronic stress begins to prioritize survival over clarity. It narrows its focus. It stops processing nuance. It becomes reactive rather than reflective. A person living in this state is not capable of the kind of calm, rational, long-term thinking that leaving a relationship requires. Then there is the silence that victims carry, a silence that is rarely chosen freely. Most victims of emotional abuse do not tell people what is happening to them, not because they don't want help, but because they have already predicted with painful accuracy exactly how that conversation will go. They know they will be asked why they stay. They know they will struggle to explain something that sounds almost incomprehensible when spoken out loud. They know there will be no bruises to show, no incident dramatic enough to justify the weight of what they are carrying. So they stay quiet, and that silence becomes another wall between them and the help they desperately need. Perhaps the most heartbreaking dimension of the victim's fog is the way it produces a fierce, almost irrational defense of the abuser. Outsiders watch this and feel baffled, sometimes even frustrated, but this defense is not confusion about whether the abuse is real. It is a psychological survival mechanism. When a person has invested enormous amounts of emotional energy, time, identity, and hope into a relationship, admitting the full truth of what that relationship is means confronting a loss so total it can feel unsurvivable. The mind protects itself from that confrontation by finding explanations, by remembering the good moments, by constructing narratives in which the abuser is struggling rather than cruel, wounded rather than dangerous, capable of change if only given enough love and enough time. When most people imagine an emotional abuser, they picture a monster, someone visibly cruel, openly hostile, radiating malice in a way that makes them easy to identify and easy to avoid. But that image is almost never accurate. And that inaccuracy is one of the most dangerous misconceptions that exists around this subject because it means that real emotional abusers, the ones who are actually in people's lives, in their homes, in their beds, go unrecognized for years, sometimes forever. The emotional abuser is rarely the most frightening person in the room. They are frequently the most charming, the most generous in public, the most well-liked. The person everyone else describes as incredible while the victim sits quietly carrying a private reality that nobody around them would believe. This is not accidental. The public persona of an emotional abuser is not separate from their abusive behavior. It is part of it. It serves a function. It creates a social environment in which the victim's experience becomes almost impossible to report because the report will always be measured against the abuser's reputation, and that reputation has been carefully, deliberately constructed. The abuser knows on some level that their behavior behind closed doors requires cover, so they build that cover with charm, with generosity, with humor, with likability, and they build it so well that when the victim finally speaks, The most common response they receive is, but he's so nice, but she would never, but I've known them for years and I've never seen anything like that. That response doesn't just silence the victim, it confirms what the abuser has been telling them all along, that the problem is them, not the relationship. What drives this behavior at its psychological core is an almost always unmet and unacknowledged need for control. Emotional abusers do not abuse because they are evil in some simple cartoon sense of the word. They abuse because control is the only way they know how to manage an interior world that feels profoundly unsafe. Many, not all, but many carry deep histories of their own trauma, their own experiences of powerlessness, their own early environments where unpredictability and pain were constant. The need for control that developed in response to that environment did not disappear when they became adults. It transferred, it found a new target. And in an intimate relationship where vulnerability is unavoidable and another person's behavior cannot be fully managed, that need for control becomes expressed through the systematic psychological domination of their partner. This does not mean the behavior is excusable. Understanding the blueprint does not mean accepting the damage, but it matters because it explains why emotional abusers so rarely experience themselves as abusers. They are not typically sitting in a room somewhere consciously plotting how to destroy another person. They are operating from a deeply ingrained set of psychological reflexes. Reflexes that tell them that control equals safety, that vulnerability equals danger, that another person's emotional autonomy is a threat to their own survival. Every manipulation tactic they employ feels from the inside justified. The gaslighting feels like correcting a misunderstanding. The guilt tripping feels like expressing pain. The silent treatment feels like self-protection. They have constructed an internal narrative in which they are always, without exception, the most reasonable person in every conflict. This is also why confronting an emotional abuser almost never produces the response a victim hopes for. The victim goes into that conversation hoping for acknowledgement, for accountability, for the simple human recognition that something wrong has been done, but the abuser's entire psychological architecture is built around never being wrong. Accountability is not just uncomfortable for them, it is genuinely threatening at a level that feels existential. So they deflect, they reframe, they turn the confrontation into evidence of the victim's instability. They walk out of the conversation having somehow made the victim feel responsible for bringing it up in the first place. There is a belief that many people hold, sometimes consciously and sometimes not, that goes something like this. If the abuse has stopped, the damage stops with it. If the relationship ends, the wound closes. If the person is finally out, finally safe, finally free, then the recovery is simply a matter of time and distance. That belief is deeply consequentially wrong. Emotional abuse does not end when the relationship ends. It continues living inside the person who experienced it, reshaping the way they think, the way they relate, the way they see themselves and the world around them, often for years after the abuser is completely gone from their life. The exit from the relationship is not the end of the story. For most survivors, it is only the beginning of a much longer and much harder chapter. The most immediate and visible long-term effect is what happens to a person's sense of identity. Identity is not something we are simply born with and carry unchanged through our lives. It is something we construct, maintain, and revise through our experiences in our relationships. When a relationship systematically tells you through criticism, through dismissal, through gaslighting, through emotional withholding, that your perceptions are wrong, your